So earlier today, you mentioned in a panel discussion that the conservatism, or inside the conservative side, we need a rebellion or revolution. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I would say that rebellion and revolution, they can sound like very violent terms, which is not what I have in mind. The left loves to overthrow things through violence. We hopefully try to be a little more peaceful. But so what that means is essentially that panel discussion to which you refer, we're also talking about how to inspire young people and so on. And the idea is that, well, young people tend to rebel. It's part of growing up. You rebel against your parents. Not that it's a good thing, but that's just how it is. Young people rebel against their parents. They rebel against authority and so on. So if that's the case, then we should at least try to direct the energy of such a rebellion in the right direction. And now, of course, it's the case that the left has taken over so many of our cultural and educational institutions. I mean, that's been the case now for decades. And therefore, we see that now to be rebellious means to be rebellious against the new conservatism, which is the conservatism of the left. Now, the left is trying to conserve what they have established. And so the rebellion is one that realizes that actually the old conservatism, classical conservatism, if you will, that's the one for which it's now worth rebelling. And to challenge the hegemony of the left. And so and we see this happening both in the United States and Europe. I think the United States has gotten a little further down that road. We saw before the election of Donald Trump, we saw young people, suddenly it seemed to be cool to be in favor of Donald Trump and to vote conservative. That's coming. We see that a little here and there in Europe as well. So hopefully that kind of rebellion will continue.
Yes, and we can see it here in Europe because the last German elections, most of the young people voted for AfD
exactly.
or for the left extremist party.
Right.
But what's the next step?
So the next step, it's going to depend a little bit on which country we're talking about. But in the United States, the next step is what we're seeing right now, that the government, both local, the federal government, but the federal government then inspires more local governments as well to reenact what used to be common sense, that, for example, men cannot compete in women's sports and so on, and to crack down on anti-Semitism at universities. And there's a long list of things that are being done. So in Europe, it would mean something similar. The particular challenge, of course, in Europe, which is, we have the problem in the United States, but not to the same degree. Talking now about Western and Northern Europe. The problem, of course, the most critical problem is the Islamic immigration. We do have an immigration problem in the United States, but it's not predominantly Islamic. And so the Islamic immigration is the first thing that has to be reversed. And that should be really the first goal of a conservative rebellion. That's more difficult in Northern and Western Europe, partly because the Islamic population itself also, they can vote as well, and they're not going to vote against their own repatriation. So I think in many countries, things have to continue to get worse before people wake up, before a sufficiently large number of people wake up and realize that this is something that has to be stopped. But I would say for much of Europe, not for Hungary, thankfully, but for much of Europe, that would be the next step. Yeah.
So let's continue with your book.
Yeah.
About self-contempt of the West, oikophobia. Could you please define this word?
Yeah, so oikophobia, quite literally fear of the home, oikos being the Greek word for home or household. The term was coined by the late British philosopher Roger Scruton in 1993 in an article he wrote, and then he uses the same term several more times in his work. He is focused more on the British context, understandably, of course, he was British. And he talks about how oikophobia has been a problem since World War II. So what I did in my book, which you mentioned, is that I analyze this as a phenomenon, not just in modern times, but as an integral phenomenon of the West. And we see that, in fact, this is something that has been going on since ancient times. It comes and goes. It appears under certain socio-historical circumstances in Western societies, starting with ancient Greece. And so it is this kind of opposite of xenophobia, where you start, as opposed to hating or looking down on the foreigner, you start to hate or despise your own home. A lot of conservatives today think that this is something completely new and something just crazy. And some of them actually have been a little annoyed with me for saying that this has actually been a problem for thousands of years. Because if you say that it's a part of the West, then it's more difficult, it becomes almost more difficult to attack, because we can no longer say that this is just a small group of crazy people. But in fact, becomes a bigger problem when we see that it keeps recurring in history. But in order to understand why it happens, we do have to understand that it is a part of the fabric of the West and has been for a long time. Then it becomes easier to combat once we do understand that.
Could you please tell us some examples from the history?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it started in ancient Greece. You have the generation after Socrates, for example, in the late 4th century BC. People like Diogenes the Cynic, there are different names that could be mentioned, Antisthenes, in varying degrees, who they paint themselves as cosmopolitan. And they say, I'm not a Greek, I'm a citizen of the world. And they emphasize foreign ways, Persian ways or Lydian ways, which for them is the foreigner, at the expense of Greek customs. You see it later on in the 1st century AD in the Roman Empire. You see it, for example, in the descriptions of Tacitus and Lucan, Seneca are some of the names where we see this kind of tendency as well, although it's actually a little weaker in Rome than in Greece, but we see the same tendency. In modern times, probably the biggest first appearance of it on a broad level is in Enlightenment France. Mid-18th century, we see people like Voltaire and Diderot, Rousseau is a big one. Although, interestingly, Rousseau criticizes Voltaire for oikophobia. He doesn't use that term, of course, the term is a neologism, but he doesn't mention Voltaire, but it's pretty clear that was at a time when Rousseau and Voltaire were fighting against each other.
They had a beef.
They had a beef with each other, exactly, that's right. And Rousseau says, here there's a passage where he writes, beware of the kind of philosopher, and he's pretty clearly talking about Voltaire. He says, beware of the kind of philosopher who loves the Tartars so that he doesn't have to love his own countrymen, which is oikophobia. Oikophobia combined with allophilia, love of the other. So we see that there as well. And then it comes in Britain, late Victorian era, in the United States after World War II in the 60s and so on.
And why it's happening? What is the cause of oikophobia?
The cause is, and this is why we see it over and over again since antiquity, there are a few historical prerequisites that have to be in place for oikophobia to appear, at least on a mass level. And those prerequisites are wealth and the defeat of the external enemy. If there is an enemy that is threatening from outside, then the people, of course, will rally together to defend their own civilization. So the enemy is defeated, and there has to be an open intellectual space where intellectuals can argue with each other without too much fear of the government or the church, whatever the case is. And there has to be a certain, not complete, maybe full sense of egalitarianism, but there has to be certain movements in the direction of egalitarianism and democracy. Once these things are in place, then oikophobia finally can appear. Because then the question is not to fight an external enemy, rather the question becomes how to defeat other groups in one's own society. Because every person needs some kind of, maybe you find some individual exceptions, but most of the time a human being needs somebody against whom to measure himself, somebody against whom to compare oneself. And so if the external enemy is gone, well, then you compare yourself against other people in the same society. And then in order to raise yourself, you push down the society around you. And so vanity is a big part. On an individual level, vanity is also a big part of oikophobia. And you notice people who are oikophobes, they also tend to be quite vain because they consider themselves individually better by dint of supposedly recognizing the moral turpitude, the evil of their own societies.
So there is a huge difference between reflection to ourselves and oikophobia.
Yes, you could say that, yeah.
And because oikophobia is like when you hate yourself, reflection is when you want to learn from your past mistakes.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so that's an important point. Yeah, so obviously just criticizing some particular thing about one's own culture or one's own government or one's own history, that's not oikophobia. It's a bit subjective to say, so when does self-critique become oikophobia? Some people, if we look at a particular thing, some people would say, well, that's just self-critique. Other people might say that's oikophobia. So there's no exact, clear red line that you can draw in history and say, okay, well, this is self-critique and this is oikophobia, but at some point, so that's a little bit subjective where that line is, but the point is that there is this development and that the self-critique becomes more and more extreme as the society progresses, and so ultimately we get to a point where almost everyone with sense would agree that it's oikophobia. For example, in 2020 in the United States, in my country, where people were tearing down statues of our founding fathers, for example, that very clearly oikophobia. That, I wouldn't say that that's so subjective. That's clearly oikophobia, not just self-critique.
What we can see is that European civilization or Western civilization is like not getting stronger. So
Right.
China and the Islamic world is increasingly stronger day to day, year to year. Do they have oikophobia?
There is such a thing as non-Western oikophobia. The Chinese, I'm not an expert on China, but my impression is that the Chinese are not very oikophobic. They seem very nationalistic. And most of the Islamic world also, I would say the same. There is non-Western oikophobia in certain places in the non-West. For example, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, you can find it. You can find it in India. And that happens because of Western influence. It's mostly a Western phenomenon. But so an example, this is actually an example from my own experience as well, because I worked as a teacher for a while in sub-Saharan Africa. But so what happens is that you have somebody from a village, from an African village, who travels into the city of his country. And in the city is more westernized. And so in the city, he sees all these amazing, expensive, fancy Western things like cars and computers and movie theaters and so on. And he experiences these things. And then when he goes back to his ancestral village, the village of his tribe, he then looks down on the old traditional ways after having experienced the Western ways. And so that is non-Western oikophobia, because then he considers the West to be better than his own traditional culture. So that certainly happens in parts of the non-West. But when it comes specifically to China and the Islamic world, I actually think a little bit of oikophobia there would probably be a good thing. So,
we know that there are three bases of the Western civilization: Rome, Greek civilization, and Jerusalem Christianity, and the Judeo-Christian world. What is the root? So which part of our base is the root of oikophobia?
Well, so if you have to choose between those three, I would say the Christian one. But it's not. So again, oikophobia did happen in the pre-Christian world as well, as I mentioned. So it's not just that it's the Christians' fault or anything. It happened in pagan Greece as well. But what happens, and something that contributes to oikophobia, is a certain universalism, awareness of the other. And obviously the Christian religion is one that has universal ambitions. And so that can contribute to oikophobia. Obviously, there are many people who are against oikophobia who are conservative Christians and who want to preserve the Christian inheritance. So very often Christianity can be a tool against oikophobia. But there is one strain of Christianity which has this attitude that, well, we're all one big human family. And if that's the case, then obviously it becomes easier to invite, for example, Islamic elements or other foreign elements into one's civilization. So that is a danger. But there were Greek philosophical, especially Greek Hellenistic schools that contributed to Christianity. I mean, the early Christians, for example, drew from Stoicism, from Greek Stoicism. The early Greek Stoics had the idea of logos, reason, that is in all of us, and in different measures. So some of us are more reasonable than others, but logos, which is divine, which was the same as God, essentially in their view, if all human beings have logos, then that means that there is something divine, something sacred in all of us. And that is an idea that the Christians were influenced by the Stoics, and the Stoics were still pagan. So such an idea, this kind of respect for the universality for the universal sacredness of all human beings, that's not the same as oikophobia, but it can help oikophobia to spread. So I can't say that it's just one pillar and not the others, but more Christianity than the Greco-Roman paganism. Yeah.
You mentioned several historic events when oikophobia appeared. Does the consequence of oikophobia is like catastrophic always, or?
Yeah. So usually,
for example, it's like the collapse of the Roman Empire,
right,
like the French Revolution. They are catastrophic events.
Yes. So oikophobia, of course, is not the only cause of those events. Certainly, there are many other contributions to the collapse of a civilization, but oikophobia is certainly one of them. So there are three possible outcomes to oikophobia, and sometimes you get more than one of those. Either a society, when it has become very oikophobic, it doesn't necessarily collapse, but it becomes geopolitically irrelevant, and it just kind of sinks into itself. It kind of continues to exist, but has no more influence on the world.
Like Europe nowadays.
Like Europe nowadays, exactly. The second possibility is that it collapses to violent infighting, basically some form of civil war or civil strife, because these different groups that are competing against each other, when there's no outside enemy, they start to fight each other. And the third possibility is that it gets overrun by foreigners, either like in the Roman case through barbarian invasion. Nowadays, of course, we don't have barbarian tribes, the Huns or the Visigoths, but exactly. So a different form than in Rome, but still a kind of a similar thing that you invite people who are enemies to your own civilization. So these are the three different possibilities, but we can get more than one. So for example, as you said, the first one that I mentioned, much of Europe already has suffered from this, and they can also get the last one as a result, where they don't stop the Muslim quote-unquote invasion. Like, it's not a violent invasion, but it becomes violent more and more as more Muslims come into the West. So that's basically what happens. Because sometimes people, the left, will criticize what I say, because they'll say, oh, do you really think that that London or Paris is going to be like Rome in 476 AD? And I said, well, no, not exactly. But in a slower way, yes. Not that you have a sudden battle and a sudden invasion, no, but there will be the slow process by which the city becomes something else and becomes overrun by a foreign element.
How can we fight against oikophobia? Because if it has like a catastrophic end, then we must stop it somehow.
Yeah.
Were there any point when the Western civilization could stop oikophobia?
No.
Oh, cool.
That's a quick answer. Well, so, I mean, the fact that history points in a particular direction, history shows us that certain things have happened. Of course, that doesn't mean that we should just give up and say, okay, we can't do anything. No, we still have to make an effort. So it's important to point out that these things don't go in a straight line. I mean, social developments are always a zigzag. Yeah, it's not straight. And we see this in the United States. I mean, the United States was becoming very oikophobic, very progressive, and then all of a sudden Donald Trump became president the second time and is now undoing some of the things that oikophobia caused. So we see it's not a straight line. After Donald Trump, we'll see what happens. It might continue in an oikophobic direction. We'll see. But so it's certainly possible, even if not to stop it completely, to at least to hold it back and to slow it down. We can certainly do that. And that's something, I mean, that goes back a little bit to your earlier question about what the next step is. That would certainly be the next step in Europe to try to stop this. And the hope that we might have is something that the Romans did not have. If you suddenly have an army that's coming and invading, well, you don't have any time to react. You have to fight the battle, and if you lose the battle, well, then it's over. At least here now in Europe, since there's not an actual army that's coming, at least Europeans have the time to begin to understand what's going on. And as you mentioned yourself earlier, now, for example, in Germany, a lot of younger people were voting for the AfD. And so we see that there is at least a possibility that people will slowly start to wake up. I do think, unfortunately, that for a lot of European countries, this cannot be stopped without violence. I'm not desiring violence. I'm just, as a descriptive matter, I do think that that's what's going to happen. Because it has gone so far that the problem cannot be solved without violence. But we'll see. At least it's not impossible in certain, at least in certain places.
Every cultural aspect has two levels: individual level and the institutional or social level. How can we fight this phenomenon, oikophobia, in these levels?
On the institutional level, you mean, or on
both?
On both. So on the institutional level, education, of course, is a big part of it. The answer there is not to have higher degrees of education, because in fact a lot of the most educated people are also the most oikophobic people, like the PhDs and everything. Rather, the idea is to have a different kind of education. And that has to start very early with small children in school, to teach them a more heroic version of national history. That doesn't mean, of course, that one completely ignores bad things in history, no. But it means that one has to put them in a sort of heroic and redemptive context, and inspire them with the heroism. Young people desire heroism and recognition of their courage and bravery and so on, that one uses historical figures for this purpose, to inspire them to love their own nation. People should have more children. This is maybe then moving a little bit from institutional to an individual level. When people have a lot of children, and this is something that I appreciate in Hungary, that the government, maybe not being completely successful, but at least they're trying to make people have more children. And that's important, because when people have children, then they often have a desire to pass on to their children their own traditions. Religion has an important role to play. We see now, for example, among Catholics in much of Europe, young Catholics desire to go to the Latin Mass. It's something more traditional rather than the sort of old 60s style service that had become popular. So those things are important. Even if somebody might tell you that, oh, well, I don't really believe in God, or I don't believe in the theological aspect of it, and you would tell them that, okay, but at least appreciate the aesthetic aspect of religion. Understand that for example, we can see from here almost the basilica there on the hill. Understand that even if you don't believe literally in the Bible, you can still appreciate the beauty of such a building, and understand that that is something that's worth preserving, and to go there and to see that it's something of beauty, and that this is something that is part of what you have become and of what you are today. These are things that have to be emphasized in order for oikophobia to be combated.
Sadly, our time is up, but thanks a lot for this eye-opening
Thank you so much. My pleasure.